Hello there everybody, welcome back to the channel. This week for the tier list, I've got for you all a ranking of the Pokemon from Kanto. This is the first generation of Pokemon. We're going to be ranking the Kanto Pokemon based on just how much I like them. There is literally no other criteria, a lot of nostalgia base, but mainly just purely on how much I like these designs. So without further ado, let's get into the ranking here, and we're going to start with the starters. Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle. These three Pokemon are amongst the mascots of the franchise. I love these Pokemon. Kanto is one of my favorite regions, grew up with this region, so how can I not love these three starters? Still amongst the best designs of any starters in the entirety of the series. And so I'm going to rank all three of them in S tier. This is a tough one because I've always preferred Bulbasaur a little more than Charmander, and Squirtle unfortunately is my least favorite of the three. But when it comes to the middle stage evolutions, the order is actually the exact same. I would go with Ivysaur, Charmeleon, and then Wartortle. But I still have to put all three of them in S tier. They're some of my favorite Pokemon, this whole line. And then we get to the final evolutions, and this is where it gets a little harder to rank them amongst the starters. I know it's basic, but Charizard is one of my favorite Pokemon. A lot of that stems from the anime, and he was one of the first Pokemon I ever used in any Pokemon game ever. So he is going at the top of S tier. But then when you get to Blastoise and Venusaur, they're both very cool in their own right. I love the consistency of the Bulbasaur line. Venusaur does look like the perfect final evolution for that line. And Blastoise does as well, and the cannons are very cool, if a little strange. It's like an animal design. Both Venusaur and Blastoise are awesome, but I don't rank them higher than the original three starters in my opinion. I love those three designs, so only Charizard makes their way higher, and I would put Venusaur slightly ahead of Blastoise. Next up is the Caterpie line, and I've always enjoyed this line because Ash had them in the anime. Very simple designs, but they're good designs. I would put Caterpie and Metapod in B tier, and then Butterfree I do really like. It's a nice evolution of a butterfly. I put it in A tier. Next up is the Weedle line, and I also really enjoy these Pokemon, although because I never used really any of these bug Pokemon in the games, I've never been as big of a fan of as the Caterpie line. I would also put Weedle and Kakuna in B tier. I'd put Kakuna actually ahead of Metapod. I think he's cooler looking. And then Beedrill I think is one of the cooler Pokemon that's out there that kind of sucks, but I would still put him in A tier. I think it's an awesome design. Always had a massive soft spot for the first regional bird with the Pidgey line, but in all honesty, these are very, very simple designs. I do think Pidgey is one of the weaker designs, so even though I do have a soft spot for this Pokemon, I would put Pidgey in C. I do really like Pidgeotto's design, and maybe because it was part of Ash's team longer than the rest of the Pidgey line, I would put that one in A, and then Pidgeot would go in B. I'd put him at the top of B. Next, we're getting to some of the most annoying Pokemon of all time, Rattata and Raticate. Rattata is one of the most annoying Pokemon of all time, and because of his frequency, I want to put him in C, although it's not necessarily a bad design. Raticate is a much cooler design. I would put Raticate in B tier right behind Kakuna. Spearow is a cooler design than Pidgey, but still not necessarily one of my favorites. I'd put Spearow right behind Caterpie, and then Fearow would also go right ahead of Caterpie. I still do prefer Pidgeot's design overall. Ekans and Arbok now, and I do think Ekans is also a B tier design. Let's say right ahead of Caterpie as well. And Arbok I would put right at the top of B tier. Next up, Pikachu and Raichu. Of course, Pikachu is S tier. He is the face of the entire Pokemon franchise. We take Pikachu for granted. He is one of the greatest Pokemon ever. I'd put him right behind Blastoise in the S tier. I've also always enjoyed the Raichu design, even though I originally, as a kid, didn't want to evolve my Pikachu because Pikachu didn't want to evolve in the anime. So I'd also actually put Raichu at the top of A. The Sandshrew line now, and I've also really always loved these Pokemon. Sandshrew I think is a very interesting design. I've always liked how he rolls around. Sandshrew is a, let's go with top of B. And then Sandslash is much cooler. You got the spikes like the hedgehog spikes. You got the sharp claws going in the top of A tier right behind Raichu. Now we're on to the female Nidoran line, and the female Nidoran I've never personally thought was as cool as the male Nidoran. It's more mousy than like the male Nidoran being more like a kind of a cross between a dinosaur and a rabbit. I would say female Nidoran for me is bottom of B. I would put it right ahead of Kakuna. And since we're talking about male Nidoran, I would actually put male Nidoran at the top of B, let's say right behind Sandshrew. And then Nidorina and Nidorino. Always liked Nidorino a bit more. I think Nidorino is iconic, obviously, because of the opening of the original game. I'm going to put Nidorino in A tier at the bottom. But Nidorina, I think, is pretty close to being that A tier level. Not quite the top. I'd put Nidorina right behind Fearow. And then you get to Nidoqueen and Nidoking, two of my favorite Pokemon from this region. Both of them I do really love. Nidoking for me is an easy S tier, and for me would go right behind Blastoise. I love this Pokemon. And then Nidoqueen is also very close to that S tier. I would put her right at the top of A. Still an awesomely designed Pokemon. Never really thought about using Clefairy much until she became a fairy type, but Clefairy and Clefable are both cute. For me, Clefairy's a B tier Pokemon, let's say right behind Nidorina. Clefable though is lacking a bit in imagination. It's basically just a bigger Clefairy. There's not too much different. So I'd put Clefable a little lower, say right behind Spearow. And now that we've done this many Pokemon, I've realized that I don't think we're going to have too many D's or F's. So I'm going to drop Rattata and Pidgey into D. And let's drop Weedle, Metapod, Raticate, Kakuna, and Nidorina all into C for now. Okay, next up is Vulpix, another cute Pokemon that I've always liked. Love that Brock had one in the anime. I'm gonna put Vulpix at the top of B. Ninetales is also great. I would say right next to Vulpix. It's really hard to separate them for me. Jigglypuff, another one who's one of the icons of the entire franchise. Not gonna put her in S tier, but I'll put Jigglypuff up in A, at the bottom of A for me right now. And I do think Wigglytuff is enough of an evolution. Similar to Clefable, not a huge jump, but Wigglytuff would still be a B tier Pokemon. I would say right next to Clefairy. Next up is Zubat, another super annoying Pokemon from the early game, and I did not like Zubat really at all until Crobat came around. The design is also pretty simple. It's just a bat. I'm gonna put Zubat in C right behind Raticate. Then after that you have Golbat, which is also an interesting design with its tongue in the early sprites and its massive mouth. I like Golbat, never loved Golbat. I'm gonna put Golbat in C tier as well, at the top of C tier. Oddish is alright, never loved Oddish. Let's say C tier right behind Nidorina. Gloom is one of the uglier Pokemon. That's kind of the point, and the anime episode about Gloom was pretty great, but still I would say D tier, maybe right behind Rattata. But Vileplume's a big step up. Do really like Vileplume, my favorite of the line. I'll put Vileplume in B tier, let's say right behind Clefairy. Next up is the Paris line. Paris is alright, never really liked using them in the game that much. I'll put Paris in C tier as well, right ahead of Zubat. And I'll put Parasect right behind Golbat, also in C. I've always strangely liked Venonat. Interesting design. I'm gonna put Venonat in B tier right behind Ekans. But Venomoth, I don't know. Just something about Venomoth. Kind of a weird looking Pokemon. Never really loved it. C tier right behind Golbat. Diglett is such a simple design, but one that I think really works. I'd put Diglett in B tier, but Dugtrio I think is a pretty lazy design. Just 3 Diglets together. I don't know, never really loved the Dugtrio designs, and it definitely gets worse with Alola. Let's say Dugtrio's right behind Venomoth. Meowth is a great design. For the cat designs, a lot of them are very simple. Again, one of the best parts of the anime, definitely one of the funnier parts of the anime. I'll put Meowth in A tier, right ahead of Jigglypuff. And I've always liked using Persian in the games, maybe because I wanted to have that Pokemon that Giovanni has, right, from the anime and from the game. I'd put Persian in A tier as well, right ahead of Butterfree. Psyduck, also one of my favorite parts of the anime. Don't know if I could quite put him in A, but he'd be towards the top of B. Let's go with right behind Vulpix in B. Golduck is pretty cool as well. I think a solid evolution, one that's very different from its base. Not much more than a B for me as well. Again, really like the Mankey line because of Ash having one. So I would say Mankey and Primeape are both B tier for me. I love Annihilape. Growlithe and Arcanine, certainly my favorite fire types in this region outside of Charizard and the Charmander line. They're iconic for a reason. I love both of them. I would put Growlithe in A tier, right behind Persian, and let's put Arcanine up there in S tier. Poliwag line now, and I like Poliwag, but my favorite, oddly, of this line has always been Poliwhirl. I like Poliwhirl. I don't know why. I think it's the perfect version of this swirly frog format. I'd say they're all B tier for me. Poliwhirl would be towards the top of B tier, and I would say right behind Sandshrew. I do really like Poliwhirl. Poliwag, my least favorite of the 3. And we'll put Poliwag down right ahead of Ekans. And then Poliwrath, because it's a fighting type, I've always liked that, but it doesn't necessarily look like a fighting type. I think they could have done more with this. I'd put Poliwrath right behind Golduck here, ahead of Wigglytuff. Gotta love the Abra line, especially if you played the early Pokemon games like Red and Blue, and I truly love all three of these Pokemon. I think Abra for me is my least favorite of the three. It would still go towards the top of B tier, and I would put it right behind Vulpix. Let's go ahead and place Kadabra right at the top of B tier. And then Alakazam for me is an A tier. I do really love this Pokemon. I know people make fun of the fact that it just gets a second spoon. That's really all it changes, but I've loved using this Pokemon in a lot of different games. I'm going to put Alakazam right behind Sandslash. The Machop line is interesting because I don't really like the humanoid looking Pokemon usually, but the Machop line's always worked. It's like that perfect combination of creature and humanoid. Machop is my least favorite. It goes in B, but towards the bottom of B. I would say maybe right behind Mankey. Machoke's always been my favorite of this line. I've always liked Machoke better. I think his cool scars are one of the reasons. He's the first one that has that championship belt, you know, but I think he's just a really cool design. I'd actually put Machoke at the top of my A tier. I love this Pokemon. I've always thought this was one of the coolest Pokemon. Even with 4 arms, Machamp has always been a little too humanoid for me. He crosses that border from having that long snout of like Machoke into being a bit more humanoid in his face. Still though, a very cool design, one I've used a lot in Pokemon playthroughs, and I'd put him in B tier, but he'd be about mid B tier for me, right behind Primeape. Bellsprout line is alright, never been one of my favorites, although my girlfriend loves Bellsprout, so she'll be very upset if I don't put Bellsprout somewhere in the B tier. And I think Bellsprout is a unique enough design, kind of a goofy design, but certainly unique enough to put in B tier. Let's put him right ahead of Wigglytuff. Weepinbell certainly my least favorite of the three. I think Weepinbell is a really weird looking Pokemon. Kind of the point, but is a little too weird for my liking. Let's put him in C tier. And then Victreebel I do think is pretty cool. I think I'll put Victreebel right behind Wigglytuff. Tentacool, oh my god. This Pokemon is maybe worse than Zubat for me in terms of annoyingness. I hate running into Pokemon while I'm surfing, but even with that prejudice, I still like this design. It's a cool design and one that I've always wanted to use despite how annoying it is. I'll put Tentacool at the bottom of B. Tentacruel, though, is pretty awesome. That one episode of the anime where you got the giant Tentacruel always made me a little afraid of this Pokemon. Let's put Tentacruel right behind Golduck in B. Another classic line here with the Geodude line. Always liked all three of these Pokemon, although my favorite for sure is Golem. I would put Golem in A tier. I think Golem is a really cool Pokemon. Let's say right ahead of Butterfree, right behind Growlithe. Graveler is certainly my least favorite of these three. I think Graveler belongs firmly in the B tier. I would put him right behind Mankey. And then Geodude is just interesting enough, you know, the floating around with his big kind of buff rock arms. Always kind of stood out to me, especially in the anime. Brock using him all the time. I gotta put him mid B. I would think I would put him right behind Clefairy. The Ponyta line is also very cool. Do have a little bit of a soft spot for Ponyta, considering that was the only fire type you could use in Generation 4 until Platinum, unless you started with Chimchar, so I have used this Pokemon quite a bit. I'd put Ponyta in the middle to top of B, let's say right behind Fearow here. And I think Rapidash is a big upgrade. I'd put Rapidash right behind Nidorino. Slowpoke is also very iconic. I love Slowpoke. Somewhere in B, I think ahead of Psyduck for sure. Let's say right behind Vulpix there. And then when we look at Slowbro, I think it's a similar placement. Let's put Slowbro in B right behind Pidgeot. Another great design, Magnemite, especially for the inanimate object design Pokemon. Not too many that are really creative, but I think this design is fairly creative. I'd put Magnemite right behind Machop ahead of Graveler. And even though I gave that same justification for Dugtrio, that I didn't love the fact that it was just 3 Diglets, the same could be said for Magneton, but for some reason, it just works better for me with Magneton. Let's put Magneton right behind Bellsprout. Okay, on to Farfetch'd, a Pokemon that never used because it sucks. Unless to use Cut. That was definitely a use for Farfetch'd. Certainly love that it got an evolution eventually, but never loved Farfetch'd. Certainly a C tier Pokemon for me. I'd say right ahead of Weepinbell. I never loved Doduo. It's okay. I would say C tier as well. Maybe right ahead of Nidoran. But Dodrio I actually do like quite a bit. Enough to put it in the B tier. Seal, I always thought was a pretty basic design. It is just a seal. I would say it's a C tier. Dugong is better, but I just really never loved this line. I'd say Dugong is C tier. Let's go right behind Golbat. I like Grimer, pretty good design, but Muck I think is a lot cooler, a lot better. Just the simple evolutions in Kanto. Somehow they still really work. I'll go with Grimer right ahead of Magnemite, but Muck is going to go actually really high. I'm going to put Muck right behind Rapidash. Okay, we're making our way through. Hope you're doing the Poke Rap along with me as we make our way through the final few Pokemon here. Going with Shelder. Never loved Shelder. I think a C tier for Shelder. Let's go right ahead of Nidoran. Same thing with Cloyster. Never loved this line, but I would say Cloyster is cool enough to drop in B tier. Let's say right behind Ekans. Before we go any further, here's your friendly reminder to please like the video. It helps me out so much. Subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. I have another tier list out where I rank every Pokemon game from best to worst. Make sure you check that out and comment below. Let me know your thoughts so far on the tier list and what your favorite Pokemon from Kanto are of all time. I love the Ghastly line. Everybody loves the Ghastly line. One of the cooler lines around. For me, Ghastly is the only B tier of this line. I'd put Ghastly right behind Vulpix, but Haunter and Gengar certainly make their way towards the top. I love Haunter. I think Haunter's an awesome design. Haunter's going in A tier right behind Golem, and then Gengar is an S tier Pokemon. One of my favorite Pokemon of all time. Certainly one of the coolest designs ever, in my opinion. Oh, it's close between this and Bulbasaur for me, but I think I would put Gengar just ahead of Bulbasaur, right behind Charizard. Onix is a really cool Pokemon. Always thought Onix was awesome. Kind of sucks that he's pretty bad in the original game. I never used Onix because he sucked so much. But he's a massive, giant rock snake. Like, I always thought that was awesome. The anime does a good job making him look really cool. But I do have to dock him points because he's not very good in the games. I would still put him relatively high in my rankings because I think he's a very cool Pokemon. Let's say right after Slowbro here in B. Also never been a big fan of the Drowsy line. It's alright. I like Hypno more than Drowsy personally. I've never loved the like wiggly fingers that Drowsy always does. It's kind of freaky. Let's go with Drowsy in C tier right behind Dugtrio. And I'll put Hypno right at the bottom of B. I like the Krabby line because Ash had him in the anime, but Krabby is just a little too simple in my opinion. Like Pidgey, it is just a crab. I'm gonna put Krabby in D tier, but Kingler, even though it's just a crab, it's a lot better crab. Kingler goes in B tier. I like the idea of Voltorb, but this line is also far too simple in my opinion. Voltorb though works enough to be towards the top of C, and I do like the red on top, white on bottom design a lot better than the Electrode design. Let's put Voltorb right behind Farfetch'd, but Electrode, I'm sorry, I think I'm going to have to put Electrode at the top of D. Execute's also another Pokemon that I've never really loved. I think this is a C tier for me. And then Exeggutor, though, I think is a lot cooler design. Fun palm tree design with the coconuts being faces, I think is a pretty fun, unique design. I use Exeggutor a lot, actually. Not going to quite say Exeggutor is A, but let's go top of B, right behind Muck. Cubone's a great design. I really love Cubone. I think Cubone belongs towards the top of B as well. And you know what? Some of these Bs might need to make their way towards A. We'll see. We'll regroup at the end of the tier list. Marowak not quite as cool for me, but because I love the Cubone design so much, I still do really like Marowak. I put Marowak right at the bottom of B, let's say right ahead of Clefable. Always had a massive soft spot for the first two Tyrogue evolutions, you know, before they were Tyrogue evolutions. Hitmonlee, I love this Pokemon. I think Hitmonlee is awesome. One of my favorites for sure. So simple, but he looks like an alien and he's got big legs kicking, you know, obviously named after Bruce Lee. So I thought that was neat. I'm going to put him at the top of A for right now. I really want to put him in S. Hitmonchan's a little too humanoid for me, but still easily a B tier for me, but I would put Hitmonchan a little lower. Lickitung, certainly one of the weirdest Pokemon ever. One that, I don't know, still have that nostalgia for the Kanto Pokemon and this design. I'd put him in B tier. Coughing and Wheezing, I like both of these Pokemon. Prefer Wheezing. I'm going to put Coughing at the very bottom of B. Wheezing is mid to bottom of B, right behind Grimer. Rhyhorn and Rhydon, love these two designs. Rhyhorn is very cool. I think kind of like a metal looking tank rock of a rhino. Rhyhorn's an A for me. I'll put Rhyhorn at the bottom of A, but Rhydon is easily an S tier for me. One of my favorite designs, and I actually like Rhydon better than Rhyperior, although obviously not as good to use. Put Rhydon right ahead of Wartortle in S. Chansey's another iconic design, definitely an A tier for me as well. Put Chansey right behind Haunter. Tangela I've always thought is a really cool one too, a body just made of vines with little feet. Let's put Tangela in B tier right behind Vileplume. Kangaskhan being one of the harder Pokemon to find in the original games always made me like it more. I'm going bottom of A for Kangaskhan. Horsey's a cute little seahorse, but not much more than that. I'd say mid to bottom of B for Horsey, but I never never thought Seadra was much better. I think both of them are pretty mid. I'd put Seadra just slightly ahead of Marowak in B. Goldeen, kind of too basic of a goldfish type design, and not a Pokemon I ever use in the game. Let's go with towards the bottom of C for Goldeen. Seaking is cool, but it does just look like a fish to me. I don't know, it's not too much unique about this that screams Pokemon. It just is kind of a fish. I'd go right behind Zubat in C. Staryu's just a starfish, and I do kind of like it. That gold in the middle with the little red eye. Staryu's still a C tier for me, but Starmie, massive upgrade. The two starfish next to each other spinning around. Also how powerful it is being able to use that psychic type early in the first Kanto games was a massive advantage. I'm actually going to go bottom of A tier for Starmie. Mr. Mime, one I've certainly gone back and forth on a lot. I don't love humanoid Pokemon, but there's something about Mr. Mime that was very funny. But Detective Pikachu really saved Mr. Mime for me. I thought it was hilarious. I don't know. Can't save it too much, though. It's a C tier. Let's go bottom of C. Scyther has always been awesome, though. Even though Scyther is not necessarily powerful enough to use in a playthrough on its own before it becomes Caesar. I love the color scheme and the design. The blade arms, that's something I'm a sucker for sure. I'm going A tier right behind Haunter. So everyone's pick for the F tier of Generation 1, Jinx. Both Electabuzz and Magmar are pretty cool. I would say B tiers for both of them as well. Put Electabuzz right behind Onix, and let's put Magmar right behind Bellsprout. I've always thought Pinsir was awesome. Never liked the design as much as Scyther, but still an A tier Pokemon for me. I'd put Pinsir right behind Chansey. Tauros is just a bull, but I love the way Tauros is used in the anime. It's also super powerful in the original game. I'd put Tauros right behind Onix. Magikarp's a tough one because it is so iconic, right? It's awful in the games, but it's that kind of rite of passage you have to do once to train a Magikarp into a Gyarados. Like, if you haven't done that, have you really played Pokemon? And I'm not talking post Generation 6 when you've got experience share for the entire team. You got to do it when you have to train your Magikarp with either the experience share that's just on one Pokemon, or where you have to put it out in front and then pull it back every single battle. I have a lot of great memories with Magikarp. It's going B. I'll put it at the very bottom because it's not a great Pokemon. But Gyarados is certainly an S tier. I love Gyarados, one of my favorite water types ever. I'm going to put it right behind Bulbasaur. Okay, we're down to our final line of Pokemon here, starting with Lapras, which is an easy A tier for me. Love using Lapras in the games. As a transportation Pokemon in the Orange Islands episodes, also thought Lapras was great. You know what? Actually, it's not an A tier for me. I'm going to put it in S tier. Let's put it right behind Rhydon in S tier. Ditto. Ditto's a fun little Pokemon. Never really used Ditto. It was cooler as a concept. The fact that it was hard to find originally in the games also kind of elevated it in my mind, but I don't have much nostalgia for it outside of just the fact that Ditto is Ditto. Let's put Ditto right in the middle of B tier. We'll put it right behind Geodude. Eevee and the Evolutions, all of them are at least A tier. We'll start with Eevee. I don't necessarily love Eevee as much as everyone else, but I can understand why everybody loves it. It's a cute little dog Pokemon. I'd put it in A. Now for Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon. As you can see throughout the list, water type isn't necessarily my favorite go-to type, but I have to admit, Vaporeon is the coolest looking of these three. It's the most unique out of all of them. I like the spiky fur on Jolteon. I think that is pretty cool, but the way they so effortlessly made Vaporeon fish-like, I would actually put Vaporeon in S tier right ahead of Wartortle. Jolteon gets close. I think Jolteon is an A tier, and I would put Jolteon right behind Sandslash. And Flareon's my least favorite of the three. Not that it's a bad design. I think the tail looking kind of like a flame is pretty cool, but it doesn't necessarily scream fire type as much as Jolteon screams electric type and Vaporeon screams water type. So I would leave Flareon right at the bottom of A. Next up is Porygon, one that I've never had much nostalgia for, never used it really at all in the games. It's a B tier Pokemon for me, right behind Hypno. I've always liked the fossil Pokemon in this game, although I prefer Kabuto over Ammonite. Both are mid B for me. Then Almastar and Kabutops. As you can tell throughout this video, I'm a sucker for Pokemon with blades for hands. I always thought Kabutops was awesome. He's going in A tier. I'd put him right behind Starmie. Almastar's not really a massive step up for me though from Ammonite. I do like the spikes on its shell, but it's still just a B tier for me, and a little lower B tier if I'm being honest. Put him right ahead of Wheezy. Aerodactyl is kind of just a pterodactyl. Its unique typing though made it one that I used quite often early when I was playing Pokemon. I've got to put it in B tier, and I think I've put it right behind Tauros here ahead of Electabuzz. And now the sleepiest Pokemon around, my pal Snorlax. Snorlax is a very simple design, but it's easily an S tier. One of my favorite Pokemon to go back and reuse over and over again in these games. So that takes us to our first legendary trio, the trio of elemental birds. Of course, have nostalgia for these Pokemon, even if they're not great to use. Articuno to me is, outside of always being one of the worst legendary Pokemon until recently, Articuno's also always been my least favorite design. Kind of similar justification that I use for the evolutions. Articuno could just be a giant blue bird. There's nothing that really screams ice type to me. It's gonna make me put it in B tier. I would still put it ahead of Pidgeot, but I would put Zapdos and Moltres both in A tier. Zapdos and Jolteon have a very similar design to them, where they both have the spiky fur and feathers in Zapdos's case. That makes it very distinct that they're lightning bolts part of that electric type. I'd put Zapdos right behind Nidoqueen, and then Moltres would go right in the middle of A for me. I think I'm going to put it right ahead of Haunter behind Golem. We get to our pseudo-legendary Pokemon for Kanto here, and it's the Dratini line. I like all three of these Pokemon, although Dratini to me is the simplest. I think there's a big step up with Dragonair, so I'd actually put Dratini towards the bottom of B. I don't think it's that unique of a Pokemon, but I think Dragonair is very cool, and I would put Dragonair towards the top of B, let's say right behind Muck. And then of course Dragonite is an S tier. It looks like a dragon, but it's so cute and lovable. I love the small wings. I love how powerful it is. I've used it so many times. It's always a goal to try to get Dragonite in your playthrough. For me, I'd put it right in between Squirtle and Venusaur. And then finally, we get to Mewtwo and Mew. Pokemon was such a fundamental part of my childhood. One of the first franchises in both, obviously, video games, but television, film, multimedia franchises that I ate up. It's such an important piece of my childhood and something that I've always loved throughout my whole life. The stories of Kanto and the stories of Mewtwo and Mew were always amongst my favorites in the entire series. I think also from design alone, both of these Pokemon are great, but Mewtwo is one of my favorite Pokemon ever. It's really hard to say what Pokemon is my favorite of all time, but I have to put Mewtwo as my favorite Kanto Pokemon ever. So all that leaves is Pokemon 151, and even though Mew isn't quite as grandiose as Mewtwo, it doesn't talk like Mewtwo does in the movies. There's something about that rarity about Mew, the first mythical Pokemon, and for me growing up, Mew was the gold standard of that. It was like getting Mew was one of the most difficult things you could do. It was something that was almost impossible, and so every time I am able to use Mew in a game, it does feel really special. And so Mew is a Pokemon that to me certainly belongs in that S tier, and I think I would put it right ahead of Vaporeon. So that's my list. Thank you so much for watching. Let's look at it one more time. I love the Kanto Pokemon, and if we're ranking every Pokemon ever, a lot of these C and D tiers might be a tier higher in their respective list. Jinx would still be F, but I try not to be overly biased and keep that middle tier, that B tier, stocked full of Pokemon that I don't think are quite among my favorites of all time. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Again, make sure you hit that like button. You subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. And if you want to see me rank every other generation of Pokemon from my favorite to least favorite, let me know in the comments, and I will do Johto next. I am planning on continuing this series through all 9 generations. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you all next time.